passion and pageantry of college football lives here. This is the Paul Finebaum Show, Hour 1 podcast.
This might be college football heaven.
And it is Tuesday, and the whole college football world continues to talk about what is going on in New Orleans. You thought the big news was last week with the Super Bowl. You have the SEC and the Big Ten big shots meeting in the Big Easy, and we are going to get right to that, plus a number of other stories making news today. Let's start with some headlines. How about this? Michael McCann may be shooting down what some folks in Georgia and Alabama think is a way around NIL by protecting players' tax bill. Well, you might want to think again, according to McCann. He'll join us later. But in New Orleans, the people that matter the most in college football are meeting yesterday, today, and tomorrow, trying to figure out what is next. And let's not waste a second, get right down to Noah and talk to Ralph Russo, who's covering it for The Athletic. Ralph, thank you for joining us. Appreciate it. So, set the scene for us in what is apparently going to be a very momentous couple of days. Good afternoon, Ralph.
Yeah, I think it could be. It's definitely setting the stages for some big things. Whether they come out of here with a definitive plan, and there's still, there's always more meetings in college sports, Paul. So even if they come out of here with a united front, and I think that's the idea for the SEC and the Big Ten, as much as possible, as much as legal, to come out with a united front in terms of the playoff. And then you go to the, that meeting in Dallas. I think there's one coming up next week or the week after, and sort of present your ideas and say, hey, this is, I think, the way we're going to go with this playoff moving forward. A little bigger, 14, maybe 16. And it certainly looks like the idea is to try to set this thing up where conferences have automatic bids, have multiple automatic bids, with the SEC and Big Ten getting 4 and the other 2 power conferences getting 2. Now, again, I suspect there'll be some negotiations there, but unlike in the past, when the new contract kicks in 2026, and that's what we're talking about. We're talking about what the playoff will look like with 2026 forward. They don't need unanimous consensus around the table of the 10 commissioners and Notre Dame. The SEC and the Big Ten can kind of do what they want. So if this is what they want, my guess is this is what's going to happen.
Let me start with 14 versus 16, Ralph. Doesn't seem like a big deal unless you're number 15. But what do you hear on that to start off with?
I think what you hear is, as to say what one AD told me, if you're going to go to 14, why not 16, right? And I also would wonder if 16, with a couple of extra spaces for at-larges, creates an area where if I'm the ACC and the Big 12, now, well, first of all, maybe if I go to 16, I can get, instead of 2 spots, maybe I can get 3 guaranteed. But it also creates, if you have more at-larges, more open spots, maybe I'm thinking, oh, that's the place where I'll get an extra team or 2. Right? Maybe. Now, you could also be setting yourself up for the SEC or the Big Ten to get 6. But I would be, and this is me being a little more conjecture because I haven't talked to anybody in those leagues to try to figure out what their counter strategy is. But that's why I think 16 could be interesting. And again, it sort of eliminates buys too. You have more games being played. I don't know if that's necessarily the way they'll go. But I know there's a whole bunch of folks who think, again, if you're going to go to 14, well, why not 16?
Ralph, one thing that keeps coming up, and I don't think there's a specific answer, but if we go down this road with 16 and all the automatics, what happens to the conference championship games?
Yeah, well, think of it as no longer conference championship games as much as conference championship weekend, right, or play-in tournament weekend. I think that's a very fair question to ask in terms of, I know there's been this idea floated around, and it really was born, I think, within the Big Ten, of you set up a conference championship game, 1 versus 2, and that will essentially determine who gets the number 1 seed or who's in line for the number 1 or the number 2 overall seed in a bye, right? And then you'll have these other games, these other playing games, 3 versus 6, 4 versus 5, to determine who gets the other spots, the other automatic spots. But if you do that, those games that are winning in games become far more interesting than your quote-unquote championship game, where both teams are essentially in. So I do think that's something to balance, right? Like, I think you're still on the hook for playing a championship game, but again, you're reimagining the championship weekend almost as the first weekend of the playoff, where you have 3, 4, like you have all these winning in games to play into the playoff, high stakes games that in some ways look like the first round of the playoff, or by de facto first round of the playoff.
Talking to Ralph Roof. Ralph, you've covered the sport from a national perch for many, many years, and I'm just reading a couple of quick stories since this news first broke. But a lot of it is very critical of the SEC and the Big Ten, saying that they are doing this at the expense of the game. They are bullying their way to owning the sport. Everyone knows what that conversation is, but as somebody who knows everyone in the game and has a very objective view, you're certainly not as close to the sun as we are down here. What do you make out of that criticism, and is it justified?
So I think some of it's justified. My biggest worry about this SEC Big Ten quote-unquote takeover of college sports. And now listen, those 2 leagues, folks in those 2 leagues would push back on that, me even using that terminology, and I get it, is I understand the criticism of like, well, are you, like, why do you need these bids, sort of the micro criticism of the move of the playoff. My concern is more macro, and that is, how much do you want to marginalize the rest of college sports? And at some point, if you tell, I'm just going to pick a few random here. If you tell Syracuse fans, Oklahoma State fans, Kansas State fans, Georgia Tech fans, you know, your schools, they don't matter that much when it comes to this playoff. Your conference doesn't matter that much, not as much as our conference. How much do you then sort of shrink the tent of what college sports is to the extent where it now creates a problem for the entire enterprise, right? It's one thing to sort of say, okay, we're going to marginalize some of these group of 5 schools. You know what, Paul? I'm sure there's a lot of Sun Belt fans who also root for SEC teams. I'm sure there's a bunch of MAC grads who also root for Big Ten schools. I think when you start marginalizing big schools that have played for big things, which you find in the Big 12 and the ACC, I do wonder if you're going to hurt the whole enterprise of college sports in general, because you're going to have a bunch of people who are going to say, yeah, sure, I like to watch Michigan and Ohio State, but you kind of pushed me out of the tent here, and I'm not that much interested in watching your playoff if my team doesn't have much of a chance to get into it.
Great stuff. A lot to figure out. Ralph Russo, we'll let you get back to lunch. Ralph, appreciate it. Live from New Orleans. We take a break here. A lot to discuss. A lot of criticism coming in, as we said. What do you think? The phone number here, of course, is 855-242-7285. We have a few more guests other than Ralph. We'll get the ACC version from Mr. ACC, David Hale. Michael McCann on the legal ramifications of what people in Georgia and Alabama are trying to do. Back with more.
You're listening to the Paul Finebaum Show podcast.
We are back. Great to have all of you here. So, some reaction coming in from all the conversation about what is happening right now in New Orleans. Let's check out Mason, who is in New York. Hello, Mason.
Hey there. I wanted to, I wanted to talk about with the college football playoffs, with it potentially going to 14 or 16 teams, and tell you what I think about this. I know it's not real, but
okay.
Basically, I just think that it wouldn't make college football as com- competitive. Like that's my first time I've ever done this, but it wouldn't make it as like you could get in theoretically then with like 3 losses, which I just think is, it doesn't make it as competitive as it used to be with 12 teams. The worst it could be is if it went to 16. That's all I think about it. I think it's bad because it will make teams non-competitive. That's all I have to say.
Well, Mason, thank you for sharing that. You can quibble about that. See, the number of losses to me doesn't matter. It's really, have you beaten anyone? Are you capable of beating anyone? And I think that's really how some of the dregs snuck in the playoff last year, because they had beefed up records because they didn't play anybody in the non-conference, while Texas was playing Michigan, while other schools were playing major programs like Georgia playing Clemson. You had Indiana playing a bunch of high school teams. I'm not even sure they were high school teams. Irvin is up next in Georgia. Irvin, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Paul. How are you?
We are doing well, thank you.
Oh, good. I don't know the young man's name that you just got through interviewing, not the phone call, but I forgot.
His name was Ralph Russo.
Yes, sir. If point blank, Paul, if we're gonna go to a 14 to 16 team playoff, you might as well just have the SEC and Big Ten, because these other teams are not going to be able to compete. And my thing is, you can have like the young man just said, you can have a 7-3 team and make the playoffs. Teams like, and I get it, and I'm going to probably ruffle some more feathers. Alabama, they're trying to keep Alabama relevant. Trying to keep Alabama relevant. Trying to keep teams like LSU, because teams like that in the SEC supposed to set the standard. Now, I know my beloved Georgia Bulldogs are going to always be there, but when you don't have Nick Saban anymore in the league, and the SEC is going to try to keep Alabama relevant, and going to 14 to 16 teams is gonna always put Alabama in the playoffs, and I don't think that's right. You might as well just.
Well, let me offer this to you, Irvin. I don't think it's specifically about Alabama. I think it's just about owning the sport. The SEC and the Big Ten let's be honest, they look down at everybody else. You and I know that. They feel like they are carrying the sport. They have the power. And they want guarantees. That's really what I think they're arguing about here. And they're going to get it. And it's not about one school or another, because I think you could debate all day whether Alabama deserved to be in more than South Carolina versus Ole Miss. It was, by the way, none of them really had a good cause, but all 3 were better than Indiana.
They sure were. They sure were. And like I said, the competition has got to be better. I would never understand why, like Boise State, Indiana, teams like that, they had no business being in the playoffs. And I'm sorry, they had good records, but they wasn't playing.
But Irvin, they were guaranteed because of things that are not even worth discussing anymore. So I think,
yes, sir.
I think what the Big Ten and the SEC are trying to do. And thank you very much for the call. We're getting a little bit of feedback. They're trying to get this thing back to a normal playoff where you really do have the best teams at the top. And I mean, even the NFL is convoluted. Everybody thinks the NFL is the greatest playoff in the world, but what is it? The NFL South? That's where Atlanta, Tampa, Carolina. I mean, that league is a disaster. There was a couple of years ago, I think it was the Panthers got in with a losing record, but they're guaranteed because they're in a division. So there's a lot of reasons for that, because those teams play each other twice. It's TV. So I mean, there's a lot of convoluted reasons for everything. I think what college football is trying to do is just make it somewhat more equitable. It's going over poorly from a PR standpoint, but on the other hand, does the SEC, does the Big Ten really care? Do they care if Stuart Mandel gets up on his high horse and starts screaming bloody murder like he did yesterday? No, they don't. Because not one voice in college football really matters any more than the other. And the powers that be they both have their own networks, they both have their own fiefdoms, and they're going to get what they want. There, I said it. Derek is up next in Atlanta. Hello, Derek.
Hey, how you doing? I have an issue with the Big Ten and the SEC trying to rule college football.
Okay.
Because I think what's going to happen is that, I don't want to see Georgia play Auburn 3 times every year, regular season, SEC championship, and then in the playoffs. That's going to get boring. I don't want to see Georgia play Ohio State 5 years in a row for the national championship. That's going to get boring. So if the other leagues just say, well, hey, Big Ten, SEC, screw y'all. We're just going to leave and do our own thing. Y'all do your own thing. I think people are going to get tired of seeing the same teams in the national championship being Big Ten teams and SEC teams every year, and it's just going to get boring. I remember one year Georgia played Nebraska in back-to-back bowl games. Yeah. They beat them the first year and lost the second year. And even one of the players said, you got to be kidding, because they were playing Nebraska
But Derek, let me remind you of one thing, though. I agree with you in principle, but if you're the Big 12 or the ACC and you're getting, 17%? 19% of the revenue, and the SEC and the Big Ten is getting 29%. Can you afford to say to the SEC, screw you? Because who is going to televise your game between Clemson and Arizona State? And who is going to care, even if it gets on over-the-air television, which it will? That's really, do you want to be the champion of the hinterlands, or do you want to be the champion of college football, which the Big Ten SEC would be?
But I think they would still show the other conferences on TV. I mean, they show bowl games.
I understand that, but my argument, Derek, is the SEC Big Ten matchup would be on all the big networks. Let's just say in theory, you'd have Georgia and Ohio State, just for fun. And then on the other hand, you got Clemson and who's going to win the Big 12?
Arizona State.
Arizona State, yeah, let's say that, or Boise. I'm not overly excited by that game, but I am excited by the other one. And everyone has a good point here. And I think in an equitable world, it would be, let's all sing Kumbaya, but we're not living in that world anymore. And
but nobody wants to see the same teams every year. It gets boring. So, yeah, they may have ratings to starting out. Yeah. But in the end, people are just going to turn off, in my opinion, and say, look, I don't want to see Ohio State play Georgia 5 years in a row for a national championship.
Well, Ohio State that's not going to be Georgia 125 million people just watched Kansas City and Philadelphia in the Super Bowl. It was a terrible game, but a lot of people watched it because it's the biggest game of the year. This would still be the biggest game of the year. The other game would not. It would be like the NIT championship.
But who won that last year? 5 years in a row. The rating's going to go down.
Well,
and you know that. That's 5 years in a row. Nobody wants to see that.
First of all, we don't know that.
I think it would. That's my opinion. I think people would just say, "Hey, look, I don't want to see this. It's getting boring. The same teams. That's why
Derek, I understand your point. I'm trying to agree with you, but you're really not letting me do that. Let's take a short break here. Before we do that, there's a lot of reaction to all of this, and we'll continue to share as much. This is our question. Should the SEC and Big Ten get more auto bids to the CFP than the other conferences? Whether you agree or not, the answer is going to be yes. We'll be right back.
You're listening to the Paul Finebaum Show podcast.
Back, a lot of conversation and some pretty sharp criticism of what the SEC and the Big Ten are about to cement down in New Orleans. Chris is up next. Hey, Chris, good afternoon.
Today. Looking good there, man. But, hey, Paul, I'm going to start off by saying make sure we get it clear. I'm not crying. The Clemson going to be there no matter what the rules going to be. If we get a spot, we're going to go be there. But what I'm going to say, Paul, I ain't really got a problem with the SEC. Yeah, it's nice to have 4 of the best teams in the SEC guaranteed to go to the playoffs. But my problem is with the Big Ten. The Big Ten, man, in the last 20 years, man, they haven't had 4 teams that no year was good enough to go to the damn playoffs, Paul. and then you're gonna guarantee them. I mean, SEC I understand, but the Big Ten I don't. But Paul, what you think about it?
Well, you're right, but what you have here is an alliance between the Big Ten and the SEC. So the more power, the more brawn, the more power and influence you get. So that's why the Big Ten is part of this, because they are the next league after the SEC.
If they're not scared and they think they're gonna put it in the next big league, or they're gonna have the most better teams after the SEC.
Yeah, by the way, Chris, maybe you missed the fact that the Big Ten has won the last 2 national championships.
Man, they won 2, Paul. I understand they won 2, but they ain't make it break it. But all I'm saying, won't they put a clause in there? If your team, if you the second best conference or the number 1 conference, you get 4 spots. But if not, that way it changes year to year. Because I'm just afraid that the Big Ten ain't gonna be able to fill them 4 spots.
Well, but
that's my
listen,
biggest gripe.
that's why they want a guarantee. And listen, it is bullying. I agree with you, Chris. But
well, just do me a favor. Tell Greg Sankey to send an invitation so we can come to SEC and come play the real football. Because no matter the rules it's gonna be, we're gonna be there, Paul. We're gonna be there. You have a nice day.
Chris, I don't know how to break this to you. You played 3 games in the SEC last year. I don't remember you winning a single one.
We didn't win not one, Paul, but hey, keep that same math for next year.
Yeah,
keep that same math for next year.
The SEC likes winners. They don't like 0-3ers. Thanks for the call, Chris. I appreciate it. Al is up next in Oklahoma. Hello, Al.
How are you, Paul?
We are doing well. Thank you.
All right. First-time caller. My comment is about the conversation you had with Mr. Russo about what's best for the college game. I don't believe that anything that's happened over the past 5-10 years is what's best for the college game. In terms of how we compete, everything has been geared toward the rich getting richer and the poor being cast aside, and that's fine because that's capitalism. But it doesn't make for a good competition. And unfortunately, I think the SEC and the Big Ten, if they continue to act this way, they're going to continue to make a lot of money. But you're going to see significant portions of the country stop watching college football because it just won't mean as much to them, whether it's, NIL money or whether it's through scholarships going up to 105 or whatever. The NFL doesn't have any of those. The NFL, there's a hard salary cap. There's a draft every year where the poor teams get to pick first. There's all kinds of measures in there to try to create parity because they have always said that that's what's best for fandom. And the same way with the NBA and all other professional leagues. They have measures in place to try to create parity. College football's thrown that out the window and said, the rich are getting richer and the poor just have to sit by and take it. And that's the same way that's what happened here with the college football playoffs and assured playoff spots. It may be capitalism and it may be the natural order of things, but whether it's good for college football or not is certainly a valid question.
But Al, it's a little bit like when you go to Congress and ask for money, and somebody says, "Hey, the debt, but the debt's getting out of control." We say, "We'll worry about that some other time." What you're saying is true, but I don't think anybody right now can deal with the truth because the game is spiraling out of control. There's so much negativity, and I think there's a real layer of discontent out there. We're hearing it; it's out there. Whether it really turns fans off or they won't watch the game, I think is another question mark. Clearly, the networks, Fox and ESPN, who are the 2 biggest sponsors of college football, still believe it's a very viable sport. Thank you for the call. Appreciate it. Jeff is up next. Hello, Jeff.
Hey, Paul. How you doing?
We are doing great. Thank you.
Did Derek say that he was going to get tired of seeing Georgia and Auburn play 3 times a year?
Yeah, I don't really know what he was talking about there, but
there's going to have to be some changes made if Auburn's going to play them 3 times a year.
Yeah, they haven't played. They haven't played more than 2 times. I think they played twice once. Yeah.
What I really called about, I don't know if I told you this before, But what was the two coaches' names before Nate Oates was hired at Alabama? I'm just brain dead right now.
The coach at Auburn was Tony Barbary, and the coach at Alabama was, who was the guy? Avery Johnson. Yeah, I've already forgotten his name.
All right, the one before him.
Anthony Grant.
And I don't know if I've ever told you this before. I remember my wife was somewhere in Tennessee, and we stopped at a store, doing some shopping, and I had on my Alabama shirt. My wife had on her Auburn shirt. So we got to talking to this man, and he said he was Bruce Pearl's daddy-in-law.
Wow.
So I stood there, and I got to talking to him. And this was Grant's the year before his last year. I think that's when they hired Pearl, when the year before.
Well, no, Grant was succeeded by Johnson. Barbary was fired in 2013, I believe, or 2014, somewhere in there.
Well, I sat there and I talked to him. Well, hey, we're sitting there just talking. He said, well, Pearl wanted to come to Alabama, but they didn't pull the trigger on Grant.
That is true, by the way.
That's what he told me. He said
well,
he was.
Here's the problem with Pearl. Pearl got slammed by the NCAA and was given what's called a 3-year show cause, which meant he could not coach during those 3 years. So when Alabama, I believe when Alabama went after Grant, Pearl was out of the industry, and I think he made no bones. I think he did want the Alabama job, but you are correct about that.
So you had heard that before?
Oh yeah, I've heard that.
Well, I won't never. I thought it was pretty cool. So I read his aggravated me because I was Alabama and my wife was Auburn. So we got to talking.
Yeah, and by the way, when Pearl was hired 11 years ago, it was not a slam dunk. Jay Jacobs made the decision, and he had to go to the SEC commissioner, Mike Slive, at the time, who really was not crazy about Bruce Pearl coming back in because, according to Slive, Pearl had looked him in the eye and lied about what he was accused of in Tennessee. And interesting thing, Jeff, if Bruce Pearl had told the truth at Tennessee, he may have been suspended for 3 games and would have lost a recruit, which he lost anyway. Instead, he got one of the most severe penalties and had to leave Tennessee, which he had done a phenomenal job. And it took a while for that program to come back. Let's continue right now. And Curtis is up next in Ohio. Hello, Curtis.
Hey, good afternoon to you, sir.
Thank you.
I have an issue for, teams getting or leagues getting guaranteed spots. The easiest way to solve it is if you don't play a top 30 schedule, you don't get in. Counting non-conference games, they have to count. They don't. They have to. So if you don't play a top 30 schedule, you don't get in, period.
That would be a good way of keeping schools out. I don't think that's ever going to be agreed upon, though, but it's a pretty good idea. That's why college basketball teams play such tough schedules, so they don't get caught up in the system. Thank you for the call. Appreciate it. Don is in Missouri. Hello, Don.
Hey, thanks for taking my call. I know this is all going to happen, so there's no way around it. And it's NFL Light is what they're developing between the 2 big conferences. And the main thing that makes the NFL go well, which is what Al brought up, is that hard salary cap. And all this will look good for a few years, but if they do not get some kind of control over the NIL expenses, where the rich keep controlling things, this will fail. Just like the MLB is failing with no hard salary cap. So I think that's something they got to build into this at some point, or 5 years from now, but they'll be begging that Big 12 to come back in.
Fair point. Hey, thank you for the call. Quite a conversation and quite a bit of disagreement. We'll continue with your calls. A number of other guests will be dropping by. We'll get the version of how the ACC is viewing this takeover of college sports a little bit later on from David Hale. More of your calls right after this.
You're listening to the Paul Finebaum Show podcast.
Not far off. How about the SEC basketball tournament? Starts on March 12th. That is just around the corner. Now it's actually 3 weeks away. And we'll have it all for you in a couple weeks. Rick is up next in Houston. Hello, Rick.
Hey, good afternoon, Paul. So, Paul, on this whole thing about the Big Ten and the SEC getting, what is it, 2 each automatic qualifiers?
Sure.
I don't see that. I don't see that being that big a deal, Paul. Because, I mean, let's face it. 9 years out of 10, both leagues are gonna get 2 teams in rather easily anyway. Now, I personally, Paul, I think that going to 16 teams would be the best thing, and absolutely do away with all the byes. No team should get a bye. And if you kind of think about it in the terms of playing more games, well, in the sport of football, injuries happen. One team might be rolling along and something happens to one of their stars, and that might brings them down to the level of the next opponent they might be playing. I just think 16 would be a good number, and as far as the two automatic qualifiers, it's not that big a deal because it's happening already. Hey, Paul, I had one question for you about our good friend Stacy in Alabama. Paul, do you think he even knows the name of the head women's basketball coach at Alabama?
I do not.
I don't either. I think he's a bandwagon SC fan, Paul. If they weren't winning, he wouldn't be a fan.
Thanks for the call. That was great. Swamp Dog is up next. Ready for Swamp Dog?
Yes. Hey, Paul.
Hey, Bob. Hey,
Thanks
Dog.
for taking my call. You got me? All right. Okay, man. Hey, I want to talk a little bit about the importance of strength of schedule, comparing it with basketball, March Madness, and the way that football does it. You know, you'll see teams in the tournament in basketball with like 14 losses, and you'll see a team that's not in the tournament with 3 losses. But they value who you played. You know, that's why the team with 14 losses is in there. They won 21 games, and look at who they played. Why is it so hard for college football not to look at it the same way? You know what I'm saying? They look at who you played. They call it quad 1 and quad 2 victories and all, you know, which I still don't completely understand. But they're actually looking at who you played against and why your record is what it is. Not just because of how many games you won, you know. And is it so they got the blueprint for doing it right.
Well said. Thanks, Dog. Appreciate it very, very much. How about William is up next in South Carolina. Hello, William.
Hey, Paul. My issue is that if the Big Ten and the SEC try to bully everybody, if the other conferences just say, hey, well, we're not going to put up with it, we're not going to play y'all, how would that affect rivalries like Georgia and Georgia Tech, FSU and Florida, if the other conferences say we're not going to play you? And I think what Derek was talking about earlier is that, you know, Georgia could play Auburn in the regular season, in the SEC championship, and then maybe play them again in the playoffs. And, you know, like Georgia could have done Texas if they both would have kept advancing. And I'll hear what you got to say.
Yeah, William, listen, I understand all the frustration, and I want to make it clear, there are a lot of things about this I don't like either. But you have to understand leverage and strength, and right now these are the conferences that have it all. So if Florida State and Clemson and Louisville say to the SEC schools, Kentucky, South Carolina, and Florida, or Georgia, Tech to Georgia, we're not going to play you anymore, who cares? I mean, seriously, those games don't matter that much. I mean, they're important rivalry games, but if the association is with the Big Ten, they can easily, Kentucky can replace Louisville with Illinois or Indiana, who are neighboring. Georgia can do the same, or South Carolina. These are not complicated. I know if you're a traditionalist, this sounds terrible, and in many ways it is terrible, but it's also 2025, and the SEC and the Big Ten have decided they're not going to let the little fish tell the big fish how, you know, where and how they can go places. Thanks for the call. Appreciate it. I'm just giving you the facts. Would you do it like this? I wouldn't. I mean, I think this is definitely bullying people around, but that's what's happening, though. Let's continue. AO is up next in Mississippi. Hello, AO.
How you doing today, Mr. Paul?
We are doing great, thank you.
Yes, I've got a solution for the college football playoffs.
Okay.
I don't think the SEC and the Big Ten should have a guaranteed certain number of teams participating in the tournament. The best thing for them to do, because is for them to have their own tournament, and they could have ever how many teams they want in there on their own, and just call the winner of the final game the Big Ten SEC champion. That would eliminate all this other stuff.
Well, listen, I mean, everybody's got a great suggestion. Unfortunately, I don't think the folks that run those two conferences right now in New Orleans are listening to any of us. Let's continue. Scott is up next. Hello, Scott.
Hey, Paul. How you doing, buddy? You're looking mighty fine in that black shirt, might I
thank
add.
you. Thank you very much. Johnny Cash let me borrow the shirt.
It looks good on you, Paul.
Thanks a lot.
Listen, here's my thing. I think we should go to a 16-team format. I do not want to lose the conference championship. I love the conference championship. I love seeing the banners hung up in our stadiums and put up. I mean, that's an accomplishment to win your conference. So I think that whoever plays for the conference championship, the winner of it is in the top four, and the loser in it of each one of those conference championships is your next four.
Hey, thank you, Scott. I really appreciate it. Listen, all great suggestions. They're going to do what they want to do. More after this.
Thank you for listening to the Best of the Paul Finebaum Show podcast. Watch the Paul Finebaum Show weekdays from 3 to 7 Eastern on the SEC Network. Plus, you can listen and watch on the ESPN app.